A morning in 1955, ordinary moments that became memories. The sun rose slowly, spreading a pale gold across the curtains and touching the wooden floor with soft light. The house was quiet, except for the faint drip of water in the sink and the creak of the stairs as someone stirred awake. It was the kind of silence that belongs to early morning, steady and gentle. Coffee was the first sign of life. Its aroma drifted from the kitchen and filled the rooms, promising the day was ready to begin. On the counter, the toaster hummed as slices of bread browned. The radio came alive with a low crackle. A calm announcer gave the news of the day, his voice steady, then turned to the weather and a cheerful melody that set the tone for the morning. At the table, the father unfolded his newspaper. He read a few lines, checked his watch, and sipped from his cup. The sound of pages rustling joined the quiet music of the house. Across the room, the mother moved with calm certainty. She laid out bowls, poured cereal, and added milk with a careful hand. Lunchboxes stood open, waiting for sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, a polished apple, and a folded note slipped inside with quiet affection. Soon the children appeared. One stumbled in with sleepy eyes, hair pointing in every direction. He sat at the table, spoon in hand, barely awake, but already watching the yard through the window. Another came in talking quickly, eager to share the dream from the night before, a story full of impossible details that seemed important to tell. The mother nodded, smiling, and placed a glass of orange juice by the child's elbow. She reminded them of sweaters, checked homework sheets, and adjusted collars that had gone astray. The father lowered his newspaper enough to ask questions about spelling and to remind them about their gym shoes. His voice carried calm authority. The children answered with half a nod, more focused on finishing breakfast than on words. The radio filled the spaces in between with lively music, the announcer's cheer mixing with the scrape of spoons and the clink of glasses. Then came the sound that hurried everything forward. From the end of the street, the yellow school bus gave its clear horn. The children looked at one another, then scrambled at once. Chairs pushed back, lunchboxes snapped shut, books were gathered into heavy satchels. The father folded his paper neatly and rose from his chair. The mother leaned close to tie a lace, brushed a crumb from a shirt, and lifted a handkerchief into a pocket. The door opened to the cool air of morning. The children rushed down the steps, their lunchboxes swinging, their laughter spilling into the street. At the corner, other children waited. Socks uneven, hats tilted, voices rising in bursts of chatter. They traded marbles, compared notebook doodles, and shared quick secrets before the bus arrived. The bus rumbled into view, its paint bright as ripe corn. The brakes sighed as it stopped, and the door folded open with a hiss. The driver leaned forward with a familiar smile, greeting each child as they climbed. Shoes clattered against the steps, one after another, until the bus filled with voices and pressed faces at the windows. Then the street grew quiet again. The mother stood on the porch a moment longer, her hand raised, watching until the bus turned out of sight. She returned inside, where the sink held the last breakfast bowl waiting to be washed. The father drained his coffee, folded the newspaper for his case, and reached for his hat. The radio carried on, reading the day's forecast and promising more music ahead. The house, busy only moments ago, seemed to exhale and settle back into its slower rhythm. It was an ordinary morning in 1955. Nothing remarkable, nothing dramatic. Yet in the smell of toast and coffee, in the sound of spoons and radio voices, in the call of the school bus horn, a memory was written. A memory of home, simple and steady, that would last long after the day itself was forgotten. The kitchen table was never only a piece of furniture. It was the center of the morning, a stage where every small routine came together and gave the day its shape. The chairs, slightly scratched from years of use, creaked as they were pulled across the floor. A faint mark ran across the surface of the table, where a pencil had pressed too hard during homework the night before. These details were ordinary, but in the morning light they seemed to matter. The father sat at his usual spot, the chair angled just enough toward the window so he could see the street outside. His coffee steamed in the cup beside him, sending curls of warmth into the air. He unfolded the newspaper with a practiced flick, smoothing it against the table. Now and then he cleared his throat quietly as his eyes traveled across the headlines. He read about distant cities, about decisions made far away, but he also noticed the small stories tucked into the corners of the page. A local baseball score, a new shop opening near the station. He rarely said anything about what he read, but the simple act of reading felt like a duty, as though his family's day depended on him knowing what was happening in the world. The mother worked in rhythm, her apron tied neatly at the waist. She poured cereal into bowls, the flakes tumbling with a sound like soft rain. Milk followed in a smooth stream, white against the bright colors of the boxes. Toast popped, and she moved quickly, spreading butter until it melted into the corners, leaving no space untouched. She laid out a plate of sliced apples, polished until their skins shone. A jar of jam was opened, its sweetness filling the room. She moved with efficiency, but not without tenderness. Her hands brushed her children's shoulders as she placed dishes before them. She tucked a strand of hair behind her daughter's ear. She whispered a reminder about the book report due next week. Each motion was small, yet each carried care, the kind that children would not notice until years later when they look back on mornings like this. The children filled the table with life. One stirred his cereal absent-mindedly, spoon circling without lifting, lost in his own thoughts. Another chattered about a drawing he had made in school, pointing at imaginary lines in the air. A younger one complained that his toast had too much butter, then quickly ate every bite. Their voices overlapped, sometimes colliding, sometimes blending, creating a lively rhythm that was as much a part of breakfast as the clink of spoons against bowls. The father occasionally lowered his newspaper, pretending it was to turn the page, but really to listen. He asked a question about spelling words. He reminded them to finish milk before rushing out the door. He offered a small nod when one child proudly recited the name of all the planets in order. His role at the table was steady, quiet, but never absent. The radio in the corner continued its work, giving weather updates, playing music, and filling the gaps when the family fell briefly silent. The announcer's calm voice spoke of sunshine until noon, of a chance of rain in the afternoon. Then came a burst of cheerful music, a tune that lifted the room for a few moments. The children tapped their spoons in time with the melody. The mother hummed unconsciously as she rinsed an extra plate at the sink. The father looked up from his paper, his expression softening. Lunchboxes sat open on the counter, waiting to be filled. Wax paper crinkled as sandwiches were wrapped and tucked inside. A thermos was filled carefully, capped tightly, and placed in its spot. Apples rolled gently into the metal boxes, each one checked for bruises. Sometimes a small note was slipped in too, written quickly in pencil. A simple line that read, "Remember to smile, or do your best." The notes were not spoken of, but they were read and carried quietly through the day. At times the table grew briefly still. A spoon rested mid-air. A toast crumb clung to a lip. The sound of the radio filled the space, while each family member retreated into thought. These silences were not heavy. They were natural pauses, moments where the ordinary felt almost sacred. As the meal drew to a close, the pace of the room began to shift. Shoes were sought out, sweaters tugged over heads, laces knotted and retied. The chairs scraped once more as children slid from their places, leaving bowls half empty and toast crumbs scattered. The mother moved swiftly, gathering what was left, her hands already preparing the kitchen for its return to quiet. The father folded the newspaper for the last time, tucking it under his arm. He stood slowly, stretching his shoulders as though to prepare for the day ahead. He glanced toward the window, where the first glow of the school bus could already be seen at the far end of the street. The breakfast table was no longer the center of attention. It had done its part. It had carried the weight of cereal and toast, of chatter and reminders, of laughter and silence. Soon it would hold only empty bowls and a faint smell of coffee. But it had given shape to the morning and to the memory of those who lived it. The sound came first, a low growl from the end of the street, steady and familiar, followed by the short, bright call of a horn. It was the school bus, and everyone in the house knew what that meant. The children froze for only a moment, then the kitchen burst into motion. Chairs scraped back, lunchboxes snapped shut with metallic clicks. Books were gathered into satchels, heavy with paper and pencils. A sweater was pulled over a head, the buttons fastened unevenly in haste. Shoes were tugged on without care for laces, and the mother's hands moved quickly to tie them before anyone could stumble. The father folded his newspaper and placed it neatly on the table. He finished the last swallow of coffee, set the cup in the sink, and walked to the door. The mother checked each child one last time. A collar was straightened. A strand of hair was brushed aside. A forgotten homework sheet was slipped into a bag. She kissed one on the crown of the head, another on the cheek, her eyes following every motion as if she could still hold them even after they stepped away. The door opened, and the cool air of morning swept into the kitchen. The children spilled down the steps, their voices bright against the quiet street. Lunchboxes swung at their sides. Satchels bumped against knees. Their laughter carried forward, rising above the hum of the waiting bus. At the corner, other children were already gathered. Some stamped their feet against the cool ground. Others compared the drawings on their notebook covers or traded marbles pulled from pockets. A small boy tugged at his sister's sleeve, pointing at the maple tree where dew still clung to the leaves. A girl adjusted her ribbon with care, hoping it would not slip before she reached the classroom. The bus drew closer, its yellow paint bright against the pale sky. It stopped with a sigh of brakes, and the door folded open with a hiss. The driver leaned forward, his cap tilted, his face familiar to every child. He greeted them one by one, his voice calm and warm, as though each passenger were a guest in his home. The children climbed the steps quickly, shoes clattering on metal, lunch boxes rattling in rhythm. They found seats in pairs or threes, pressing their faces to the glass as if the ride itself were an adventure. From inside came the sudden swell of chatter, voices blending into a single hum of excitement. The mother remained on the porch, her hand lifted in a wave that she held until the bus turned the corner. The father stood at the window for a moment, silent but smiling, before reaching for his briefcase. The house, so alive only minutes before, seemed to exhale. The clink of dishes returned. The radio announced the time. The room settled back into quiet. On the street, the bus carried the children away, filled with the scent of soap and pencil shavings, the echoes of breakfast conversations, and the unspoken promise of another ordinary school day. The corner, once crowded with voices, was empty again, save for the sound of a dog barking in the distance and the flutter of leaves stirred by the morning air. It was not a moment anyone thought to write down, yet it was the kind of moment that lingered quietly, waiting to be remembered years later, when the sound of a horn or the sight of a yellow bus would summon it back with perfect clarity. When the bus turned the corner and disappeared, the street seemed to pause. Its rumble faded, leaving only the faint rattle of leaves stirred by the morning breeze. The voices of children, moments ago so bright and tangled together, were gone. In their place, silence stretched comfortably, like a blanket pulled across the houses. The mother lingered on the porch for a moment longer. Her hand still rested on the railing, her eyes fixed on the empty corner, as though she could still see the yellow bus there. She exhaled softly, then turned back inside. The kitchen welcomed her with the quiet work of dishes waiting in the sink. She rolled up her sleeves, filled the basin, and the gentle rhythm of water running joined the hum of the radio. On the counter, crumbs and spilled sugar marked the rush of breakfast. She brushed them into her palm, smiling at the small mess left behind. A cereal box leaned open. A lunchbox lid had been forgotten, resting near the fruit bowl. She closed it with care, as if the absence of the children made even their forgotten objects worth tending. The father stood by the window for a while, the newspaper tucked under his arm, his eyes still following the empty street. He lifted his coffee cup and found only a sip left. He drank it slowly, then set the cup down and placed his hat neatly on his head. His briefcase stood ready by the door. Before leaving, he paused to adjust the radio dial, lowering the volume, but not turning it off. The announcer's voice slipped softly through the room, a thread of connection between the world outside and the quiet house within. The neighborhood itself moved into its slower rhythm. A screen door clapped shut down the street. Somewhere a dog barked twice, then fell silent. The milk truck rattled past, the bottles inside chiming gently with each bump in the road. Farther away, a lawnmower coughed to life, its steady hum carrying across yards. These were the sounds of a town settling back into its ordinary day. In the kitchen, sunlight spread further across the table. The father's chair stood empty, the imprint of the morning still in its cushion. The mother dried the last dish and placed it neatly on the shelf. She untied her apron, folded it, and set it on the hook by the stove. The house felt larger now, as though the absence of voices gave its walls more space to breathe. She walked to the living room and straightened the magazines on the coffee table. She noticed the shoes left at the foot of the stairs, small enough to make her smile, large enough to remind her how quickly the years were passing. She opened a window to let in the breeze, and the curtain lifted softly, carrying with it the scent of fresh grass and the faint sweetness of someone baking bread on the next street over. For a while the house was still. The mother sat with a cup of tea, letting it warm her hands. She listened to the distant hum of the world, the radio's quiet music, and the ticking of the clock on the wall. The street outside lay calm, touched by sunlight, its sidewalks lined with dew that was already fading. The morning rush had passed. What remained was stillness, steady and unremarkable, yet deeply alive. It was an ordinary silence. It would not be written down, nor remembered in any headline. Yet in the calm after the children had gone, the day carried a quiet dignity. It was the pause that made the memories of breakfast and the scramble to the bus glow brighter, the pause that gave shape to the rhythm of life in 1955. No one marked the date of that morning in 1955. No camera stood in the kitchen to capture the butter melting on toast, or the way the children hurried with laces untied. No note was written about the sound of the bus horn at the corner, or the quiet that followed when the street was empty again. Yet these moments remained, tucked deep in memory, steady as the ticking of a clock. The children remembered the taste of cereal, the weight of the leather satchel against their shoulders, the way the cool morning air brushed their cheeks as they ran. They remembered how the school bus shone like a giant sunflower rolling down the street, and how their mother's hand waved from the porch until it was too small to see. The parents remembered the breakfast table. They remembered the chatter, the half-finished homework sheets, the spilled milk quickly wiped away. They remembered the sound of the radio, steady and cheerful, filling the space between voices. They remembered how quickly the house grew quiet once the children were gone, and how that quiet was both a relief and an ache. The house itself carried traces of memory, the scratches on the chairs, the smell of coffee in the air, the faint marks of chalk dust left on shoes by the door. Each detail held the weight of routine, of repetition that shaped a family's life. Looking back, the morning was ordinary. It held no grand event, no story for the newspaper, no moment of history, yet it carried everything that mattered. Care folded into sandwiches, love hidden in small notes, patience woven into the sound of a mother's voice reminding her children to hurry. It carried the hum of radios, the warmth of sunlight, and the steady rhythm of a street beginning its day. These mornings do not fade. They return when least expected, in the smell of toast, in the sight of a yellow bus, in the sound of spoons clinking in a bowl. They remind us that life's truest treasures are often the smallest ones, the details we overlook while they are happening, the moments that feel too ordinary to notice but too precious to forget. And so the memory of a morning in 1955 lives on. It waits quietly, not in history books or photographs, but in the hearts of those who once sat at the breakfast table, rushed to tie a shoe, or waved from the porch as the bus pulled away. It is the kind of memory that lasts forever, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was real.